They didn't come because they were sure, they came because they thought they were untouchable. The morning air outside a quiet suburban neighborhood in Virginia felt unusually still, as if the entire street had paused before something irreversible. A row of patrol vehicles lined the curb with precision, doors opening in synchronized motion, radios crackling with clipped voices and coded confirmations. At the center of the operation stood a coordinated task force led by Captain Robert Hayes, a man known for his discipline, reputation, and absolute confidence in verified intelligence. The briefing had been direct, a high-risk federal alert tied to a residential address, flagged through channels that required immediate response without delay. No one questioned the scale of the response, not when the paperwork carried the weight of federal escalation markers. Inside the house, Natalie Carter was preparing coffee, her movements calm, deliberate, and unhurried, as if the world outside had not shifted into a controlled containment zone. She had lived in this home long enough for neighbors to know her as quiet, respectful, and almost invisible in her routine, the kind of person who never drew attention. Yet that morning, attention had arrived in the form of 30 officers forming a perimeter around her property. From the outside, the situation appeared decisive, almost clinical in its execution. Officers took positions along the driveway, behind vehicles, and near entry points, communicating in short bursts as they confirmed sightlines and maintained containment. Captain Hayes reviewed the file once more, trusting the intelligence summary that had been delivered through channels marked as urgent and sensitive. Everything indicated that the target inside the residence represented a potential national security concern, though the specifics remained deliberately limited to those cleared for operation. Inside, Natalie paused briefly near her kitchen window, noticing the movement outside without changing her expression. There was no panic, no rush, only a steady awareness that something had shifted beyond her doorstep. She placed her cup down slowly, her gaze lingering on the silhouettes moving across her front yard. The situation outside was building toward a confrontation shaped by assumption, procedure, and incomplete understanding. Captain Hayes raised his hand slightly, signaling readiness to proceed with initial contact, unaware that the next few minutes would challenge every layer of certainty he had brought to the scene. And inside that quiet house, Natalie Carter remained still, as if already knowing that what was unfolding outside was not just an operation, but a mistake built on information no one in the field fully understood. The first official approach began without urgency in voice, but with precision in movement, as two officers advanced slowly along the front walkway, hands visible, radios muted to avoid unnecessary escalation. Captain Robert Hayes observed from a few yards back, maintaining command distance while tracking every detail of the residence, every window, every angle that could conceal uncertainty. The house itself remained unchanged, a quiet structure of brick and pale siding, its stillness contrasting sharply with the coordinated activity surrounding it. Inside, Natalie Carter moved away from the kitchen window and walked toward the hallway, her pace steady, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if she had already measured the situation and found no need for reaction beyond awareness. Outside, the officers stopped at the front door, exchanging brief glances before initiating standard contact procedure. A firm knock echoed through the quiet street, followed by a request for verification of occupancy, delivered in a controlled and professional tone. Captain Hayes watched for response patterns, expecting either hesitation or compliance signals, but the delay that followed felt neither defensive nor confused. Instead, there was a long, measured silence, the kind that created uncertainty in operations designed to minimize it. Natalie stood just inside the entryway, her eyes fixed on the door but her posture unchanged, as if evaluating not the presence outside, but the intent behind it. She did not reach for anything, did not move toward concealment or confrontation, only remained present in a way that contrasted sharply with the intensity outside her walls. One of the officers repeated the announcement, this time more firmly, referencing the authority of the task force and requesting immediate identification from the occupant. Captain Hayes adjusted his stance slightly, noting the lack of visible response escalation, something he had learned to interpret as either calculated resistance or extreme composure under pressure. Both possibilities carried operational implications, yet neither confirmed the narrative in the file. Inside, Natalie finally moved, not toward the door, but toward a small table near the entry where a simple device rested, inactive and unremarkable in appearance. She paused for a moment, looking at it without urgency, then placed her hand nearby without activating it. The officers outside shifted their position slightly, maintaining coverage, unaware of the significance of what remained unseen behind the walls. Captain Hayes felt the first subtle inconsistency form in his assessment, not enough to alter command decisions, but enough to register as unusual. The intelligence briefing had described a scenario requiring immediate pressure and containment, yet the subject inside showed none of the expected behavioral indicators. As the silence stretched between both sides of the door, the situation became less about action and more about interpretation, with every passing second widening the gap between assumption and reality. And in that gap, Natalie Carter remained still, fully aware that the next decision she made would not escalate the moment, but redefine how it was being understood. The tension outside the house shifted from controlled procedure to quiet uncertainty as minutes continued without a clear response from inside. Captain Robert Hayes maintained his position near the command line of sight, his attention moving between the front door, the side windows, and the surrounding perimeter where officers held steady coverage. Every element of the scene remained intact, yet something about the expected rhythm of compliance was missing. The residents did not behave like a typical escalation scenario, and that absence of predictable reaction began to register across the team in subtle ways. Inside, Natalie Carter stood near the entryway table, her hand resting lightly beside the inactive device she had noticed earlier, not activating it, not ignoring it, but treating it as a final option rather than an immediate solution. Her focus was not on the noise outside but on the structure of what was unfolding, as if she were mapping intent rather than reacting to presence. Outside, a third announcement was issued, more formal than before, referencing authorization and requesting immediate confirmation of identity. The words carried authority, but the response remained unchanged. Silence. Captain Hayes narrowed his focus slightly, noting that silence itself was becoming the most significant variable in the situation. In his experience, silence at this stage usually indicated fear, hesitation, or strategic delay, but none of those patterns fully aligned with the behavioral profile he had been given in the briefing. One of the officers near the door shifted position, signaling readiness for secondary protocol if necessary, but Hayes did not authorize escalation. Instead, he observed, recalibrating his assessment in real time. Inside, Natalie moved for the first time in several minutes, walking slowly toward the front door but stopping short of direct contact. She did not touch the handle. She did not speak. Instead, she stood within listening distance, as if confirming something only she could interpret. The atmosphere on both sides of the door remained heavy but controlled, like two systems waiting for synchronization that had not yet been initiated. Captain Hayes raised his hand slightly, signaling continued hold, while requesting an updated verification status through internal communication channels. The reply he received confirmed that the operation was still classified as active and valid, though no additional evidence had been provided to clarify the initial trigger. That detail created a quiet fracture in the certainty of the field command structure, not enough to halt the operation, but enough to introduce caution. Natalie's presence at the door did not change the temperature of the moment. But it changed its direction. She finally spoke, not through the door, but toward it, her voice calm and measured, requesting clarification of the basis for the operation. The question itself did not carry emotion, only structure, as if she were asking for procedural accuracy rather than defense. The officers outside exchanged brief glances, while Captain Hayes listened carefully, noting that her tone did not match any profile of resistance he had been briefed on. Instead, it reflected something more precise, something that did not fit easily within the operational framework they were using. And in that mismatch, the situation began to shift, not toward resolution, but toward recognition that the assumptions guiding the operation might not yet be complete. Min da doc fan tai liu duok kung kap, dan sak tu de doi thu, nhung hi en tai ban chua dua ryu kor siu the kanshu lai teep theo la gi. Ban muan min lam gi voi du liu ne? 6-2. Fan tich motif utsong thuk tu de dao outline 9 fan cho tu de moi viet teep part for to 9 theo kor chu yen hey dao prompt hin on a whisk kai kan ban noi ro motu kor min se teep tuc noi theo dung format ban da theat lap. The tension inside the airport command area had been building for hours, but what no one fully understood yet was how quickly a routine misunderstanding had turned into a chain of irreversible decisions. The black female officer, now quietly observed by multiple units, stood in the center of the operations review room with calm control that contrasted sharply with the growing unease around her. Her posture remained steady, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes scanning the situation reports displayed across multiple monitors. Every update coming in from the field unit seemed to add another layer of confusion rather than clarity. The white male senior officer in charge of the on-site coordination paced slowly behind the glass partition, his expression tight, his confidence starting to fracture as more inconsistencies in the initial report came to light. He had authorized escalation based on partial information, and now that decision was echoing through every channel of communication. Outside the building, additional patrol units continued to arrive, not fully understanding the actual identity of the person they had been instructed to contain. Inside, however, the atmosphere was shifting from urgency to hesitation. One of the junior analysts quietly flagged a discrepancy in the identification logs, showing that the individual in question had credentials that matched a high-level federal appointment, but the message was not immediately acknowledged. The black female officer finally stepped forward, her voice calm and controlled, requesting direct communication with Central Command verification systems rather than relying on fragmented field reports. Her request was not aggressive, but it carried authority that made several people in the room pause. The white male officer turned slightly, watching her more carefully now, beginning to realize that the situation was not aligning with the assumptions made earlier. As the verification process was initiated, a silence spread through the control room, broken only by the sound of radio transmissions updating in real time. Outside, the perimeter unit slowed their activity, waiting for confirmation that never seemed to come quickly enough. Inside, the truth was beginning to surface in layers, not as a sudden revelation but as a gradual correction of error. The black female officer remained composed, her presence steady as the system finally began to reconcile identity records with federal clearance databases. The white male officer stopped pacing, his posture stiffening as the first official confirmation indicators appeared on the screen. What had begun as a routine enforcement response was now transforming into a procedural collapse, where every assumption made earlier was being replaced by verified facts. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, this time into something quieter and more reflective, as everyone realized that the chain of command decisions had been based on incomplete recognition of who she truly was within the federal structure. The weight of that realization settled heavily, not through confrontation, but through undeniable confirmation displayed across the system monitors. The confirmation on the monitors did not arrive with drama, but with a quiet certainty that changed everything inside the command room. The system finished cross-checking federal credentials, and the result now stood clearly on every screen, leaving no space for interpretation. The black female officer remained still as the room absorbed what the data was saying, her expression unchanged, as if she had expected this moment from the beginning. Around her, the energy in the room shifted from urgency to realization, and then into a careful silence that no one wanted to break too quickly. The white male senior officer stared at the screen longer than anyone else, his earlier confidence now replaced by visible hesitation. He slowly stepped closer to the terminal, reading the confirmation line by line, making sure there was no mistake in what the system was presenting. The report was not only verifying identity, but also confirming her position within a higher-level federal command structure that had not been properly communicated to the local unit during the initial response. A few officers exchanged brief looks, realizing that the escalation order had been triggered without full awareness of who they were interacting with. The black female officer finally spoke again, her voice calm but precise, asking for the operational chain to be reviewed in detail so that the origin of the miscommunication could be identified. There was no anger in her tone, only structure and control, which made the room even more focused on listening. The white male officer responded more slowly now, acknowledging the need to re-evaluate the entire response sequence from the beginning. Outside the room, the perimeter units were instructed to hold position and wait for updated instructions, which added to the growing sense that the situation was no longer about enforcement but about correction. Inside, a junior communications specialist quietly displayed the original alert log, showing how the first report had been interpreted in a way that escalated standard activity into a multi-unit response. The black female officer reviewed it without interruption, then asked for a full audit trail of decision-making steps, ensuring that every action taken would be properly documented. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, this time into a professional reset, where roles were being redefined based on verified authority rather than assumption. The white male officer nodded slowly, accepting that the operational framework needed immediate adjustment. No one spoke for several seconds as the reality settled in that the situation had been driven entirely by incomplete information rather than intentional cause. The monitors continued to display the confirmed federal clearance status, reinforcing the final understanding that the person at the center of the response was not a suspect but a commanding authority whose identity had been misread at the critical moment. The briefing room did not feel the same after the confirmation. What had begun as a high-tension enforcement situation had now transformed into a structured federal review environment, where every action taken earlier was being re-examined with precision. The black female officer remained composed at the center of the room, her posture steady, her attention fully focused on restoring procedural clarity rather than reacting emotionally to what had happened. The white male senior officer stood slightly to the side now, no longer leading the discussion, but carefully listening as the communication logs were replayed on the central display. Each timestamp revealed how quickly assumptions had escalated a routine identification check into a multi-unit response involving more than 30 officers across different coordination levels. The room's technical analyst highlighted a specific gap in the initial data input, showing that a single incomplete verification field had triggered a chain reaction in the automated alert system. The black female officer asked for that exact point to be isolated and preserved in the audit record, ensuring it would be reviewed at the federal oversight level without alteration. Her tone remained steady, and that steadiness kept the room disciplined and focused on facts rather than speculation. The white male officer finally acknowledged the procedural breakdown, stating that the escalation should have been paused at the second verification stage instead of being allowed to expand. No one interrupted him, and that silence reflected a shift in authority from assumption-based command to evidence-based command. Outside the facility, the response units were gradually being stood down, one group at a time, as updated clearance instructions were transmitted through secure channels. Inside the room, the black female officer requested a full reconstruction of the decision timeline, from the first alert trigger to the final deployment order, emphasizing that accountability needed to be mapped without gaps or omissions. A junior officer quietly compiled the sequence into a structured report format, projecting it onto the main screen so that every participant could see the exact flow of decisions. The white male officer watched the reconstruction closely, recognizing how quickly a system designed for security could amplify uncertainty when initial data was incomplete. The black female officer then instructed that a corrective protocol be drafted immediately, focusing on preventing similar escalation from occurring under ambiguous identification conditions. Her direction was calm but absolute, and the room responded with immediate compliance. As the final log settled into place, the situation was no longer defined by confusion or misidentification, but by the clear understanding that procedural integrity had to be strengthened at every level. The atmosphere slowly stabilized into professional order, with each officer now aligned around the same objective of restoring accuracy, accountability, and controlled communication moving forward. The atmosphere inside the Federal Coordination Room continued to shift as the procedural reconstruction reached its final stage. What had once been a high-tension operational misunderstanding was now being fully converted into a structured accountability record. The black female officer stood near the center console, her attention fixed on the finalized timeline display, which now showed every decision point in exact sequence, including timestamps, authorization entries, and system-triggered escalation markers. She reviewed the reconstructed chain carefully, ensuring that each entry reflected verified data rather than assumptions made during the initial response phase. The white male senior officer remained present but noticeably more restrained, his focus directed toward understanding how quickly automated systems and human interpretation had combined to produce a large-scale coordinated response. The technical analyst highlighted the final correction layer, which showed that the initial alert classification had been marked as unverified high priority instead of pending verification required, a distinction that had fundamentally altered the response scale. The black female officer requested that this classification discrepancy be formally flagged as a system logic vulnerability rather than a human error alone, emphasizing that both procedural training and software logic needed adjustment to prevent similar escalation patterns. The room acknowledged this without interruption, and the silence reflected agreement across ranks. Outside communication channels confirmed that all field units had now been fully recalled and debriefed, with each team instructed to submit individual activity logs for unified review. The black female officer then initiated the final step of the process, instructing that a cross-department review board be scheduled within the next operational cycle, ensuring that oversight would include both command personnel and systems engineering representatives. Her tone remained controlled and factual, reinforcing the importance of structured correction rather than emotional interpretation of events. The white male officer finally contributed a concise acknowledgement of procedural fragmentation, noting that multiple departments had acted correctly within their own protocols but without sufficient interlock between systems. That statement helped frame the entire incident not as a single-point failure, but as a layered coordination gap that had amplified uncertainty. The black female officer confirmed this assessment and added that future response architecture must prioritize communication validation before escalation authorization. As the final report version was locked into the secure archive system, the environment in the room shifted from reactive analysis to forward planning. The situation that had begun with misidentification and rapid escalation had now been fully transformed into a documented case study for systemic improvement. Every officer present understood that the outcome was not defined by conflict, but by correction, and by the reinforcement of discipline verification at every stage of federal operational response. The final phase of the federal review process unfolded in a calm, structured environment designed specifically for resolution rather than escalation. The black female officer stood at the main console as the system finalized the official case closure file, her posture steady and composed while she reviewed the last integrated summary of all procedural corrections. Every department input, from initial alert generation to final interagency coordination, had been compiled into a single unified record. The white male senior officer stood a few steps away, observing the closing sequence with a measured expression that reflected both professional accountability and procedural reflection. There was no urgency in the room now, only the quiet precision of completion as the system transitioned the case status from active review to archived improvement protocol. The final report confirmed that no unlawful intent had been present at any stage of the operation, and that the entire sequence had resulted from overlapping verification delays and automated escalation thresholds that had not been properly synchronized across departments. The black female officer requested one final amendment before closure, asking that the document explicitly emphasize the importance of identity-neutral processing in all future high-priority alerts, ensuring that recognition bias or assumption-based evaluation could not influence operational decisions. This request was accepted without dispute and immediately appended to the official record. The white male officer then formally acknowledged the corrective framework, stating that the incident had demonstrated a critical need for improved interdepartmental communication. Structure rather than isolated procedural compliance. His statement was entered into the final commentary log as part of leadership reflection. As the system initiated permanent archival encryption, the black female officer was formally recognized for her role in stabilizing the response chain during the most critical phase of the incident. The recognition was not framed as symbolic or emotional, but as a procedural acknowledgement of effective command decision-making under complex conditions. A quiet notification appeared on the central display confirming her elevation to a senior coordination position within the Operational Oversight Division, effective immediately. The transition was seamless, reflecting the institutional preference for structured advancement based on demonstrated analytical performance. The room remained still as the final data packets were sealed and distributed across secure federal archives, ensuring that all agencies involved would have access to the revised protocol framework for future reference. The white male officer extended a brief professional acknowledgement, marking the end of the collaborative review process, and the black female officer responded with equal formality, emphasizing continued commitment to system integrity and operational clarity. As both officers exited the coordination room, the environment behind them shifted into automated standby, its screens dimming as the system returned to baseline monitoring status. What remained was not the memory of conflict, but the documentation of correction, not the weight of misunderstanding, but the structure of improvement built from it. The final record stood as a reminder that precision, communication, and discipline verification were the true foundations of effective response, and that progress was achieved not through authority alone, but through the continuous refinement of how information is understood and acted upon.